We are down to our next speaker. So John Andrew is a home-based software developer that works for a software development firm in Portland, Oregon. He is also GDG Zamboanga's tech lead. His work focuses on developing cloud-based applications with Node.js and tinkering with other technologies like Arduino, Firebase, mobile apps as a sideline. So, Andrew, take it away.
Hi, I'm John Andrew. I work as a software developer at Group Development, a company based in Portland, Oregon. Mainly, I develop apps with Node.js, but I also develop mobile apps as a side job. So today I'm going to talk about Flutter and how we can build cross-platform apps with it. So Flutter is a UI toolkit made by Google which developers can use to build natively compiled applications for mobile, web, desktop, and embedded devices. So example ng embedded devices is yung, if you're familiar, yung dashboard ng kotse or maybe yung mga smart TVs. So yun. If you have been developing apps for quite a while, we may compare Flutter to these three. React Native, Ionic, and Xamarin. So just in case you don't know yet, you can also build cross-platform apps with these frameworks. For React Native, you can build Android and iOS apps using JavaScript as well as in Ionic. You can also use HTML and Vue. With Xamarin, you can also build the same, but you will going to write it in C#. So for Flutter, the language they use is their own programming language, which is Dart. So Dart is a programming language developed by Google. It is mainly designed for front-end development, but can also be used to build back-end servers and command line interfaces. It is an object-oriented language, so if you're familiar with C++ or Java, you will get to adapt to it easily. So here are some example codes. So ayan, yung main function pa lang dito, very familiar na, 'di ba? If you've been working with Java or C++. So I'm going to show more about how we can code in Dart. But first, let's see what we can use. So we have Dartpad. If you want to try out Dart or Flutter first before installing, you can use Dartpad in your browser. So while we can code in Dart or Flutter using Dartpad just by using our browser, yung negative thing, disadvantage, limitations rather dito is you cannot build it to APK or JavaScript files for the web if you want. So what we can just do sa Dartpad is testing lang talaga. So let's try and open Dartpad. So by the way, if you're watching this or using your laptop or PC, you can use your phone to scan the code, QR code. It will point you to the link above that QR code. So if you'd noticed, every link has a QR code under it or beside it. So just in case na gusto nyo i-bookmark sa phone nyo for reference later on, like this one. So you can scan this in your mobile phone. So again, let's go back to Dartpad. So first visiting Dartpad, just a quick tour of the web this tool. You can see the keyboard shortcuts here. So how you can view the documentation of a specific code. For example, you want to know ano yung main, ano yung print, ganun. ano yung for, or and other built-in functions sa Dart. So you can just highlight the code. So I'll show you later on. Or you can press F1 on your keyboard. So it depends on what platform you're using. So I'm in OS. So I'm using Mac, kaya ganyan yung commands. If you're using Windows, there are separate code commands for it as well. So here is the console. Um, dito natin makikita yung mga outputs mamaya. And also the documentation if you're going to highlight a keyword or a code. So makikita natin yung documentation dito. So later on, I'm going to show you another way by installing yung plugin sa VS Code. Mas mabilis tayong makakapag-program doon ng Flutter apps. So later on, pakita ko. So first things first, let's learn Dart. So ayun, in every Dart or Flutter application, we always have this main function. So ayun, lahat ng apps, Flutter apps or Dart apps nag-start dito sa main function na to. This is the first function that is being called when running the app. So ayun siya. So what this code do is it prints this text, hello world. So let's try to run. So yun nga, if you're going to highlight, here is the documentation of what that code do. So for this is it prints a string representation of the object to the console, which is here. So let's try to run the code. So ayan siya, yan yung ginagawa ng code na to. So next thing, let's proceed to variables. How do we declare variables in Dart? So this is how we declare variables in Dart. If you're a web developer or have tried developing a website or any JavaScript application or Node.js, for sure very familiar to sa inyo yung keyword na var. So that's how we define variables, almost the same as JavaScript. Right? So to define an integer like this, to define a float, double, and to define an array, so ganito siya, very familiar din sa JavaScript. To define an object or a map, ganito din siya, use curly braces. The difference is compared sa JavaScript, kung mapapansin nyo, yung property name is wrapped with single quotes, diba? So ayan siya. So paano naman yung control flow statements sa Dart, like yung mga if and else, for loop, and while loop? So ganito siya sa Dart. Ayan. So just in case you want to format the code after copy and pasting it, just click here above format. And it will fix the code for you. So yun, very familiar lang din siya sa ibang programming languages. Like sa JavaScript, of course, kung paano yung conditions, paano yung for loop dito. So ayan, you can use var. So what this code do is it loops through each of the items here in the fly by objects array. And ayan, the same thing din dito. That's how we use for loop in Dart and while loop. So very common lang din siya sa ibang programming languages. Then next is how do we define functions in Dart? So to define functions in Dart, actually meron na tayong example dito ng functions. This is an example of how we define a function. So another example is this one. Let's just format it. So this is how we define a function in Dart. We need to declare kung ano yung ano yung data type na nire-return ng function, which is in this case is an integer. This function returns a number. So the function's name is Fibonacci. It accepts one argument, which is an integer n. And yun, ginagamit siya dito sa mga conditions na to and to compute yung Fibonacci. So, if you've noticed, dito declared yung data type, diba, ng function or tsaka ng variable, diba? So, although this works, yung var keyword works in most cases, but as a beginner, I recommend na sanayin nyo yung sarili nyo to always define yung data type kung ano yung expected na value. So, in this case, this is a string. This case, it's an int. Then here is a double. Then, while this is an array, in Dart, we call this list. So, that's how we define, ito yung data type ng array. That's how we define an array in Dart. So in this one, this is an object if you're a web developer, familiar in JavaScript. But in Dart, this is what we call a map. So to be more specific, we can define this one, string. So which means yung keywords, yung property names niya are string, and the value is dynamic. So it can be anything. It can be an array or like this one, or it can be a string like this one. So next thing is paano ba tayo mag-import sa Dart. So to import, ganito. That's how we import packages or Dart files to a Dart project. So after doing this, we can immediately use kung anong mga functions na nandito. For example, we have my other file, .dart file, that has a function named Fibonacci. So hindi na natin kailangan, just like sa JavaScript, like for example, import my file from. So hindi natin kailangan gawin ganyan para ma-access yung functions na nandun sa loob ng file na yan. Just import it directly and then ready to use na kung ano yung laman ng Dart file na yun. So, last thing before we proceed to Flutter is very important din, how do we define classes in Dart? So this is how we define class in Dart. So ayan siya. Very similar lang din sa ibang programming languages. Just key in yung keyword na class and then yung class name. And then ito, kung mapapansin nyo, medyo iba na siya. Meron siyang, like for example dito, we have a launch date variable which the value is a date time. Then kung mapapansin nyo, meron siyang question mark dito. So ang ibig sabihin yan, the launch date can be null. Kasi kung wala yung question mark na yan, Dart will require for this variable to have a value. So, isa yan sa mga features, null safety features ng Dart. So, yan yung isang maganda din sa Dart kasi hindi siya, on build time pa lang, makikita na agad natin yung mga errors. So, advantage siya kasi before pa natin mapasa sa production or mapasa sa user yung application natin, makikita na natin yung ano yung mga possible errors, diba? Ayan. So here is an example of the constructor. So kung mapapansin nyo in other programming languages, how we create a constructor for a class is yung keyword talaga na constructor, diba? Like for example, in JavaScript, ganito mag-define ng constructor. Pero in Dart, to define a constructor, you need to use the class name itself. So kung ano yung class name mo, inside that block, to define a constructor of that, you need to use the same name, which is this one, spacecraft. And then ito yung arguments na ina-accept ng class nyo. So another thing we can do sa Dart is we can have a different constructor. For example, this one. This is a named constructor. So if we want a class to be constructed in a different way, we can use named constructor. By the way, mga overview lang to siya sa Dart. Hindi talaga siya in-depth dahil din sa limited time na meron tayo. So, yun. If you want to know more about null safety, as I mentioned, yung regarding sa question mark dito, and also about named constructor, you can visit dart.dev and to learn more about that. So, how to define a method naman sa classes in Dart is this one. The same as defining a function. Just key in yung data type. In this case, it's void because this method described doesn't return anything. So, kaya siya void. So, ayan. To access variables defined in inside this class, you can use the this keyword. So, the same thing din sa JavaScript. Meron din siyang this keyword. So, now, if you have already basic understanding or knowledge in Dart, we can now proceed to Flutter itself. So to explore Flutter, although you can still use Dartpad to try Flutter, right here, just click New Pad, click Create New Pad, and then Flutter. Ayan. Although we can still use Dartpad to explore Flutter, I really recommend to install it locally sa laptop nyo or sa PC nyo because mas magiging productive tayo using yung mga plugins na meron yung Flutter, like yung Dart and Flutter plugin sa VS Code. So, ayun siya. So, if you're ready to dive in further more into developing your first Flutter app, you're going to need to download and install the SDK. So, yun na nga yung Flutter SDK. You can also install Flutter on Windows, Mac, Linux, and even in Chrome OS. So, pwede nyo din install yung Flutter doon. So, for the code editor, you can use anything you prefer since you can use Flutter via CLI. So, via command prompt. If you want to use Notepad++, okay lang din. As long as meron kayong terminal or CLI sa machine nyo. So, for me, I recommend you to use VS Code. So, if you already have developed mobile apps using Android Studio, meron ding mga plugins para doon. So, just to show you paano ano yung installation guides. So, ito siya. So, in my case, I used Mac OS. So, ito yung guide how to install yung SDK, yung platform setup. Then, if you're going to target developing in iOS as well, so meron ding guide dito kung paano setup for iOS and also Android. If you're going to develop a Mac OS application, so meron ding guide dito. So just go to that link and then you can read. So next thing is how we can set up an editor. So in my case, I'm using Visual Studio Code. So ito yung guide for VS Code. Very useful talaga tong Flutter and Dart plugins. I'm going to show you later on. If you have Android Studio, you can install the plugins to Android Studio as well, or IntelliJ. Yeah. So this is the guide. We also have Emacs here as well, pero hindi ko pa ito na-try. So, ayun. Let's first explore yung Dart plugins and yung Flutter plugin sa VS Code. When you first open VS Code, ito yung makikita nyo, di ba? So, to download the plugins, just go here sa plugins marketplace ng VS Code, and then you can type Dart. Ayun. Check nyo lang yung pinakamadaming downloads. So, yun yung i-install nyo. So, in this case, na-install ko na siya. Also, for Flutter, make sure i-download nyo yung pinakamadaming downloads like ito. So just beware what you install in your VS Code. So if you have these plugins installed, you can just open your command palette. Yan. And then type Flutter. So ito yung mga useful na commands na nandito. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Flutter application project. So just select that, this one. And then select the folder where we want it to save it. Then type natin yung Flutter Flutter application name. Yung gagawin ng command na yun is mag-create siya ng directory doon sa folder na sinelect mo. And then it will set up the code base for you. So after that, ito yung next na makikita nyo. So ito yung output ng create project kanina. So if you're working with Node.js, for sure familiar kayo sa package.json. So yung equivalent nun sa Flutter is itong pubspec.yaml. So this is where we define our dependencies, kung ano yung mga nire-require ng application natin. Let's say for example, we're going to need Google Maps for our application. We can just define here yung Google Maps dependency, and then kung ano yung version. Yan. Then upon saving, if you have already installed yung Flutter plugin, it will automatically install the dependencies. So if wala pa, you can just type in your terminal pub.get, and then it will install the dependencies for you. So mainly dito natin ini-store yung mga codes natin for the project dito sa lib folder. So upon creating the project, meron siyang by default na main.dart file, and ito yung makikita natin na code. So ayan. So again, another functionality of installing yung Flutter plugin kanina sa VS Code is we can select here kung saan natin siya i-run. So since Flutter can run in many platforms, so pwede din natin siya i-debug in any platform. So in this case, wala pa akong iOS simulator, but I have already installed an Android simulator, as well as pwede din natin siya i-run. So test run muna natin siya sa Chrome. So just click Chrome, and then yung play icon dito. Then let's start debugging. So what will this do is it will build it will start a server, and then build yung code natin, yung Dart code into JavaScript, and then it will open a browser for us to preview yung project. So ayun, ito yung preview ng first code upon creating the project. So basically meron tayong app bar dito, and then ito yung body ng app, and then we have here a floating action button. So ano yung ginagawa basically ng first code upon creating ng project is just to demo how we can update values or states in Flutter. So ayan, if you see every tap ko dito, it updates the number, it increments the number. So we can simulate as well kung anong itsura niya dito sa mobile in Chrome. Just open your developer console in Chrome, and then click this one, toggle device toolbar, and then we can select here kung ano yung this is, by the way, this is not a Flutter functionality, it's just a functionality sa Chrome. So we can simulate kung anong itsura niya sa iPhone 10. Yan, so ganito yung itsura niya sa iPhone 10. So let's go back sa code. Next thing is I'm going to show you is to run the same code na to sa mobile app naman. So I already have here running a mobile Android emulator. So try natin i-run dito yung app. So balik tayo dito again sa target device. Then let's click yung pixel. So if pixel yung name ng emulator ko dito. So just click start and then start debugging. So ayan, ganito yung itsura niya naman ngayon pag i-run natin siya sa mobile app. So one thing I like sa Flutter compared sa React Native na na-try ko na din is yung consistency ng UI. Very consistent siya with in almost any platform na nasubukan ko. I tried it sa web, I tried it sa mobile, sa Android, and also sa Mac. Very consistent yung UI niya. Unlike as what I've experienced sa React Native, may instances na iba yung itsura niya sa ganitong device. And then ganito iba din naman sa desktop. So ganun. Although pwede nyo naman talagang ibahin purposely yung itsura niya by using yung mga media queries. So meron ding media queries sa Flutter. So if you want to create a responsive application, you can do that as well sa Flutter. So you can just search about media queries in Flutter. While this is very useful, kung familiar na kayo sa Flutter, which it can speed up yung development process mo kasi may mga boilerplate na. But as a beginner, medyo confusing siya, di ba? So let's start from scratch. So delete muna natin yung mga initial code, yung upon creating ng project. So ayun, as mentioned before, every Dart and Flutter application starts with this main function. So this main function calls a built-in run app function that initializes yung Flutter UI natin, yung mga widgets. So speaking of widgets, I'm going to talk more about it later on. So first na gagawin muna natin is we're going to create a class. So to create a class, kanina, if you still remember yung sa Dart examples, we just type in yung keyword na class and then yung class name. And then in this case, we're going to extend our class to a stateless widget. Ayan. But to avoid, I mean, since meron na tayong Flutter plugin, we can write this faster just by typing yung stls. So type stls and then press enter. So ito yung isang functionality na very useful pag may Flutter plugin, which is we can automatically create widgets just by using Flutter commands. So yun. After inputting yung STLS, meron na tayong boilerplate for a class, di ba? So what we're going to do next is just give a name for the class. So for this case, let's say home screen. Ayan. The next thing, most of the time, every screen sa isang Flutter app is we are using yung scaffold na widget. So let's use that widget here. So scaffold widget. Ayan siya. So basically itong scaffold widget, ito yung parang canvas natin, ito yung nagko-construct ng application. Diyan natin pwede define yung itong app bar na nasa taas, and then itong body, and then pwede din natin define yung floating action buttons dito sa scaffold. So, bali ito yung magko-construct ng UI natin. So, ayan siya. So, another advantage pag merang sa Flutter plugin is you can press control then space, and then makikita nyo dito kung ano yung mga available na properties na pwede nating i-add or i-define dito sa scaffold na widget. So, let's say for example, merong body. By the way, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na offline documentation. Ayan. I-hover nyo lang yung property, then lalabas itong dialog na to. Then pwede nyo lang basahin yung tungkol doon sa property na yun. Like for example, this body. So, primary content of the scaffold. So, let's first create our screen. So, dito sa body. We're going to use the text widget to output text. Okay. So, ayan. Yung next thing na gagawin natin is we're going to choose kung ano yung UI na gusto natin gagamitin. For Flutter, we can use yung UI design ng material design, or yung Cupertino for iOS. So, kung gusto nyo ng app na very iOS yung feel, we can use yung Cupertino app. Kung gusto niyo naman Android yung feel, yung design ng app, we can use material. So in this case, we're going to use material design. So to do that, just type in material app. So ayan, let's press control space. So makita natin dito kung ano yung mga properties na pwede natin gamitin. Let's use home property, and then dito natin ipapasa yung home screen natin na widget na create natin kanina. So, try natin i-build. Just press Ctrl S to save. Oh, meron tayong errors. So, natin na-restart. Ayan. So Flutter has a functionality na tinatawag yung hot reload. So, every time na mag-edit tayo ng code, and then press save, automatic na maglalabas yung update dito. But there are times na kailangan nyo siyang i-rebuild, like yung nangyari ngayon na lumabas yung error. So, to rebuild the application, we just need to click this one. So, restart, and then yung mangyayari dyan is i-rebuild niya yung application, yung Flutter code to APK. So, ayan. So, kung makikita natin, dito na yung hello world na text. Kaso nasa taas talaga siya, di ba? So, para ma-avoid natin yung status bar sa taas, we can use yung widget na safe area. So, ano ba yung safe area widget? So, a widget that insets each child by sufficient padding to avoid intrusions by the operating system. So, yung tinutukoy na intrusions dito is yung status bar and ditong navigation bar. So, if you're not going to use safe area, yung mga contents ng scaffold nyo is lalagpas siya doon. Dito. Pag may mga contents kayo na sa baba naman, mapupunta siya sa likod ng navigation bar. So, to avoid that, we can use yung safe area widget. So, yung text widget natin kanina, ilalagay natin ngayon sa loob ng safe area widget. So, safe area, let's close that. So, yung text widget kanina, magiging child na siya ngayon ng safe area. So, let's try to save. So, ayan, kung mapapansin nyo yung text na hello world, na-avoid na natin siya doon sa status bar. Hindi na siya doon nakatago sa taas. So, the same thing, if may contents tayo kanina dito sa baba, lalabas na yun siya sa taas ng navigation bar. So, the same thing din if you're using sa iOS, di ba yung iOS may notch? So, if your contents are inside the safe area widget, so maiwasan na yung notch ng device. If you've noticed, kanina ko pa mention yung widget. If you're trying to explore now yung Flutter, mas mas pa-encounter nyo pa yung term na yan. So, basically, lahat na nakikita natin dito sa screen is a widget. So, like for example, ito, text na to, this is a text widget. So, let's say for example, we need, gusto natin display yung button. We can use the elevated button widget. Ayan. So for example, in this case, meron tayong elevated button widget. What this does is it outputs a button. So ayan siya, meron tayong button dito. Diba? So let's say for example, gusto nating ilagay siya sa center, yung button dito sa middle ng screen. So the widget we can use for that is yung center widget. Yung child ng center is yung button kanina. Diba? Control S and ayun, nasa center na yung button. So ayun, if you need anything na gusto nyong i-display sa Flutter application, all you just need to search is for widgets. Let's say for example, gusto nyo mag-output ng text box. So just open Google and then search text box widget for Flutter. Or gusto nyo ba ng pop-up? So modal dialog widget for Flutter. Ganon. So yun yung mga keywords na pwede nyong i-search sa Google search. If you want to continue learning Flutter, I'm going to show you some guides, no, to continue your progress in developing a Flutter app. If you can have a separate session, mas maganda sana, and then let's try to build an entire working app, maybe a to-do list para ma-explore din natin paano yung pag-save ng states, paano i-save yung mga let's say for example, to-do items, ganun, and how do we click yung when we tap and then go sa ibang screen. For the time being, ito muna yung papakita ko. So I'm going to give you some resources kung saan nyo pwede continue yung learning nyo sa Flutter. By the way, forgot to mention, so pub is Dart's equivalent for NPM or Node.js, or if you're developing PHP applications, ito yung parang composer nila, di ba? So if you need to install something, like say for example, you want to use, like yung na-mention ko kanina, Google Maps, so you can use pub. So this is Dart's package manager, where you can get packages or modules that can make your development easier. So for example, if you need to implement animated na navigation bar or bottom navigation bar, so merong mga packages para doon dito. So it's in this link, pub.dev. For example, you want to use Firebase in your Flutter app, so you just search Firebase, and then ayun, may guide dito kung paano siya i-install, and then introduction, and kung paano siya gamitin. So ayan, if you've already tried Firebase, especially in JavaScript, for sure familiar to sa inyo. Then this is how you create a reference for a database, then how to listen for values and updates. So yan yung pub.dev. So as mentioned, if you want to continue learning Flutter, You can visit these links. Nilagyan ko siya ng number because that's how I recommend what to learn first. First, learn yung Dart language samples sa dart.dev. Very useful siya kasi although you can jump in directly to Flutter, but I really recommend to learn first yung Dart kahit yung mga basic lang kasi para mas mapabilis yung development nyo sa Flutter. And then the next thing is learn yung basic Flutter layout concepts, like paano i-assemble yung rows, paano gumawa ng columns, yung list views. Syempre, very important yun since sa mobile apps, majority ng contents is scrollable, di ba? So you need to learn how to create scroll views, list views sa Flutter. And here are some other resources that you can use. I really recommend to watch yung YouTube playlist na to, yung Flutter Widget of the Week. Maganda yung mga videos nila. It's posted by yung Flutter development team talaga yung nagpo-post. Very useful yung mga videos. Also yung Code with Andrea. So parang blog siya. Mga articles wherein you can learn how to create Dart, Flutter, and Firebase app development. So ayun, that's just a quick overview of Flutter. I hope you have taken notes and continue learning using yung mga tips and resources na na-mention ko. If you will have another session na medyo mababa yung time, at least a day siguro, we will create a full Flutter app and build it in multiple platforms. Try natin gumawa ng to-do app. So if you have questions, you can message me on LinkedIn or sa GDG Sambuanga and I'll try my best to reply. So thank you and stay safe everyone.